Okay, so today's lecture is called Punk Britain, and it's basically about the final forms of collapse of the social democratic system of the post-war period that happens, as you'll see from this lecture, from the late 60s through the 1970s. And it's going to end on the bombshell of comparing Margaret Thatcher and Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. As we finally buried the old bag yesterday, I think it will be the first time that you've heard anyone describe her as a punk. So this is my ambition for today's lecture. Okay, so this is, as I said, the last in the series of lectures that looks at the challenges to and the fracturing of social democracy in the post-war period. It's trying to explain how that system, which arguably delivered and achieved so much, lasted for such a very short time, which is why I call it the brief life of social democracy. Now, we've seen, and I've been at pains to emphasize, that in many ways the undoing of social democracy had its roots in earlier decades than the 1970s. They lay in the compromised delivery of the forms of welfare established because of the fiscal crisis that plagued Britain after the Second World War. It lay in the technocratic, not participatory nature of the project. It lay in the new forms of affluence and the reconfiguration of class that occurred in the 1950s and the 1960s. It lay in the end of the empire and the increasing diversity of the population and the debates about who welfare should belong to. And it lay finally in the criticisms of the limited nature or of the universality, of the claims to universality that we saw emerging from the youth culture and politics in the 1960s and the 1970s. I'm not today going to suggest that the 1970s was the final nail in the coffin of social democracy. What I am going to suggest to you today was that it was, in some sense, the beginning of its very end. And again, I'm going to be emphasizing that the crisis of the 1970s, insofar as there was a crisis, was a global economic one, a global economic crisis that all countries in the world suffered from. There was the collapse of the regulation of the currency system through the Bretton Woods system. Most currencies were floated in the period between 1968 and 1971. In the mounting budget and trade deficits that occurred in the following years, of the oil crisis in 1973 when there was an Arab oil embargo in response to the US support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and the widespread experience of so-called stagflation. All of this led to the deregulation of money and currency markets and the rise of a new critique of the Keynesian forms of management of economic life that had predominated since the 1940s. But I'm also going to be suggesting to you again today that there was a specific type of flavour to this crisis in Britain during the 70s. And that had a number of characteristics to it. The first was, of course, that this marked the final collapse of the last vestige of Britain's imperial economy. It wasn't just the Bretton Woods system that collapsed in the late 60s and early 70s. It was the sterling area, which you'll remember had been created in 1931 to prop up the value of the pound, despite a series of devaluations of it from the 1940s through to the late 1960s. Another specifically British element of it was the growing national obsession with decline, with the idea of decline that historians now term declinism. This took several forms. Contemporaries thought of Britain as suffering decline in a number of different ways. Its world in the role was declining as the empire had been lost and Britain was trying to reconceive of itself as a European, as a part of the European project. There was an obsession with Britain's relative economic underperformance that was often equated to a sense of economic decline, that Britain's economy was becoming less and less significant in the global, on the global stage. There was the sense of moral decline that I talked about on Tuesday, which was associated with the growing attack on the 1960s and the permissive legislation that it was seen to have unleashed. And finally, there was a sense of a political crisis, or a sense of the decline of the political system in Britain, both in terms of the seemingly growing apathy of the electorate to turn out to vote in elections, but also, rather as in the 1920s and the 1930s, a very broad sense that the party political parliamentary system had failed to resolve these important structural problems that Britain was experiencing. And then finally, there was an obsession with the labour movement, and in particularly the role of trade unions, and the role that trade unions had played within the mixed economy of the social democratic system. Arguably, the trade unions in Britain had never been as fully incorporated into economic life as they had been in Germany after the Second World War. But of course, they were far more central than, for instance, the unions played played a more central role than the unions played in the US in the post-war period. What we see in the 1970s is an increasing critique of the role of unions in ways that had been unimaginable 20 or 30 years earlier, when they were seen as a central pillar of economic management of the mixed economy. And all of this ends up culminating, I'm going to suggest, in the formation of punk in the middle of the 1970s, from 1976 to 1978, and the election of Mrs. Thatcher as the leader of the Conservative Party, and her eventual election as Prime Minister in 1979. There was, I'm going to be suggesting, a sense that, just as the Sex Pistols were singing, there was anarchy in the UK, and it required some sense of new authoritarian or anarchic response to it. So I'm going to talk to you today basically in these three different sections. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about how important the politics of race and nation were to the growing political instability of the country. I'm then going to talk to you about the new forms of economic ideas and economic policies that developed in the 1970s. And then finally, I'll end up by being as mean to Mrs. Thatcher as I can possibly make myself in a balanced, scholarly way. And when I talk about the politics of race and nation, I'm going to do this basically in three sections, because I think there are three quite connected but nonetheless separate elements to it. The first is the debate about immigration and race relations and what becomes known as multiculturalism and the criticisms that develop around that. The second is the politics of Northern Ireland. Remember, we saw the beginning of the civil rights movement there in 1967, 1968, and that situation degenerates very quickly into one of armed conflict. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about the process of devolution in Scotland and Wales, where Scotland and Wales are trying increasingly to break away from the English state or to find new forms of self-government. In all of these sections, what I'm basically trying to say is that the very fabric of the nation that had been long established since the Act of Union of 1801, remember, which is the act that creates the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the union of the nation is beginning to crumble and fall apart. So let me start with immigration. Now, the first thing I want to say here is that immigration had been going on for centuries, as you already know, in Britain, but it only becomes problematic at very specific moments. It's rather like the endless rediscovery of poverty. It keeps on occurring at very specific moments. So the question of immigration becomes politically explosive at particular times. So remember the debates about, for instance, Jewish immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century. Remember the concerns that I was talking to you about immigration from the Caribbean and from India and Pakistan in the late 40s and early 50s. Now we have, in the 1960s, a return of the visibility of those issues. And it has really very little to do with numbers of people. As I say here, immigration from the UK continues to exceed those for immigration in the period from 1945 to 1979. And you can see that in the 1960s and through to the 1970s, the percentage of so-called foreign-born population in the UK is remarkably small. Just 0.2% of the population have been born in the Commonwealth, and that rose to 1.2% in England, as opposed to the United Kingdom as a whole. That figure was 1.2%. By 1971, that had risen to a figure of 6.6%, although that is the population of all people born outside the UK, not just across the former empire, now known as the Commonwealth. It's also true, as I said before, that there were particular pockets, particularly in London, the North West, and the Midlands, where the population migrants were much higher. In London, some wards or parishes had was populated by people of colour by as much as 20%. In Wolverhampton, it was 5% in the middle of the 1960s. Even by 1991, though, when only 5.5% of the population is now designated an ethnic minority, which is the new category that was being used then, 30% of London's population fell under that heading. So what I'm trying to say here is that even though the percentage of so-called ethnic minorities had risen to 1.2% in 1971, by 1991 it was still under 6% of the total population, even if there were particular areas of concentration within specific geographical areas. Nonetheless, as I'm trying to suggest to you, even though the numbers weren't huge, immigration begins to be seen as really problematic in new types of ways. And you see this, I think, most clearly in the growth of a new type of English nationalism. A new type of English nationalism that takes new political forms with the creation of the Organisation of the National Front and the British movement in 1967 and 1968, both concerned to introduce schemes of forced repatriation of non-white people. Now, part of how this becomes increasingly contentious was about the effects of decolonisation, and particularly new policies that were being adopted in newly independent states like Kenya and Uganda, who were undergoing policies to Africanise their populations by expelling their Asian populations, most of whom were South Asians who had arrived in those countries as indentured labourers during the late 19th or 20th century. The Kenyan Asians came first between 1964 and 1968, when some 20,000 of them arrived in Britain. And it was this sense of a new specific group of people coming that set off the fears of a so-called new wave of immigrants. As that flow of people dried up, the Ugandan Asians followed as Idi Amin began a policy of forced expulsion. And from 1968 to 1972, the Ugandan Asians arrived in Britain. There were in these times attempts to try and think, and this is a very old story in Britain, but there were attempts of trying to figure out ways in which these populations could be resettled in what was left of the British Empire. So there really were serious discussions about whether these populations could be sent to the Falkland Islands, which, as you know, was still part of the British Empire and had a climate that everyone would enjoy. The 1968 Immigration Act, which remember follows on the heels of the 1962 Immigration Act and the Race Relations Act of 1965, basically was a much more restrictive piece of legislation, restricting entry only to those people with fathers or grandfathers born in the United Kingdom. I don't think you need to see these figures. Okay, so into this mix steps the figure of Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell was an intellectually brilliant Conservative Member of Parliament. He was a classicist at the University of Cambridge. We've come across him once before because alongside Barbara Castle, he, remember, denounced the treatment of the repression of the Mau Mau in Kenya in the middle of the 1950s. And during the late 1950s, he becomes Assistant Secretary at the Treasury and becomes increasingly influential in the development of conservative economic thought at that time. In the early 1960s, he becomes Minister of Health in the final days of the final years of the Conservative government. And by the middle of the 1960s, he's widely regarded as a future leader of the Conservative Party, indeed possibly even the next leader of the Conservative Party. All the more fascinating, then, that in 1968 he makes a speech which became the defining speech of his political career. He made a speech which basically shattered the cross-party consensus that the issue of immigration should be not openly debated, that it was a too contentious area and the politicians had to be very careful about inciting forms of racial hostility or even racial hatred. This speech became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. And what it does is did two key things. First of all, Powell rejects the idea that Britain has an obligation to its former imperial subjects. Indeed, he says, quite unusually for conservative politicians, that the empire had been a dreadful mistake, and Britain should not think that it has ties of obligation to its former imperial subjects. The other thing that Powell does is to argue against the pervading tide that was seen very clearly in the Race Relations Act of 1965 of cultural assimilation. He develops what some people have called a new type of racism, saying that racism wasn't about biological differences, it was actually about unbridgeable cultural differences, that the idea of cultural assimilation was impossible. And thus Britain was not just being swamped by immigrants, in the language of the day, but English culture and law was being transformed in the process. And for him, the Race Relations Act of 1965 was a great example of that, because it seemed to him to penalise those very people who felt that their national culture, their jobs, their houses were being taken by people from other lands. And in the middle of this speech, he gave a very famous fable about this old lady who lived on this street in his constituency in Wolverhampton, who watched her entire street being taken over by people of colour, so that she was left in a sort of in a house in a little island, feeling as though she was living in an alien land, and that her letterbox, people kept putting notes through her letterbox and even excrement through her letterbox, calling her a racialist. This was the example for Powell of how the tables had turned. Okay, you won't have to listen to this. Now, this speech was, as you can imagine, hugely contentious, and Powell was immediately sacked from his position in the shadow cabinet, and very quickly became backed by an outpouring of support on his behalf. And the London dockers, for instance, came out on strike and marched to the House of Commons to support Powell. By 1972, he was Britain's most popular politician, with somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population claiming support for him. The Immigration Act that followed in 1971 further tightened the screws of immigration. So even though Powell is denounced, there is a growing sense that there has to be a tightening up of the immigration laws. I'll tell you about 1981 later. Now, there was, of course, counter voices to this flood of English nationalism and racism. And you can see it in two ways. The first was the continuation of this idea of a discussion about race relations that had began in 1965. In 1976, the Race Relations Act tightens up the laws against racial discrimination, both direct and indirect forms of discrimination, and sets up a new commission for racial equality to try and promote racial harmony in a whole series of different types of ways. So there's a governmental response, but there's also a popular response, which you can see in the formation of the group of musicians who form an organisation called Rock Against Racism and another related organisation called the Anti-Nazi League. Rock Against Racism was formed in 1976 in response to some remarks, rather drunken remarks, by Eric Clapton in a television interview, where he came out in support of Enoch Powell and ended up shouting the National Front slogan of "Keep Britain White." David Bowie also got himself in trouble by appearing to embrace Hitler and fascism that same year. And, of course, during the punk movement, you can see that very clearly from the Sex Pistols and that clip that I just showed, there was an increasing prominence of swastikas and Nazi iconography in punk fashion. So in response to all of this, a bunch of musicians wanted to make the case that not all musicians were racial harmony. And so bands like The Clash, the Buzzcocks, the punk band The Buzzcocks, the reggae band Steel Pulse, that had Sly and Robbie in it, and Tom Robinson of Glad to Be Gay were all key figures in this. And they held a famous rally in London's Victoria Park in 1978 where 100,000 people marched from Trafalgar Square to Victoria Park, which is in the East End of London, for a concert. Okay, I'm sorry, I must move on because I get, it's like watching my youth flash before me. Too depressing. So let me move on to the situation in Northern Ireland. So the second way in which the United Kingdom began to fall apart was through the breakdown of the political process in Northern Ireland as in response to the civil rights movement of Catholics there. In the early 1960s, a new reforming head of the government in Northern Ireland came in, a guy called Terence O'Neill, and he begins to attempt to introduce some reforming elements. For instance, he tries to open up public housing to Catholics and even begins to talk about having a meeting with the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, which, of course, was hugely contentious to the Protestant majority. As you know, what this process does is actually help animate and infuse the Catholic civil rights movement with the formation of NICRA, and yet, in a very famous demonstration march in Derry in 1968, the Royal Ulster Constabulary break it up very violently, and this is one of the images from that demonstration. These images are flashed around the world and are a real sign of the growing violence in Northern Ireland. In 1969, O'Neill resigns, and there are a whole series of riots that break out throughout 1968 and 1969 as Catholic civil rights campaigners clash with Protestants and with the Protestant police forces. And troop